I never should have allowed Hank to step inside our home that day, not even for a quick drink. That's where it all started, on a balmy Tuesday afternoon, filled with the scent of freshly mown grass and lingering regrets. My husband, Frank, had just departed for his annual week-long fishing getaway with his brother, a tradition he'd kept since retiring. I stayed home as always, nurturing the garden, diving into novels, and sorting through the mess that seemed to pile up behind every cupboard door. It was a routine we both knew well, but this time, something felt different. Hank had been Frank's buddy since their military days, serving side by side in the late 70s, returning with shared scars and private jokes I could never quite grasp. Hank was a familiar face at gatherings, barbecues, holidays, the odd football watch party. He had a down-to-earth kindness, always lending a hand with firewood or dropping off war documentaries for Frank. Our conversations were brief, limited to small talk over dessert or coffee. That day he stopped by, claiming he was nearby and noticed the ladder still propped against our house. I'd told Frank the gutter was blocked again, and he promised to fix it after his trip. Hank, though, was insistent. "Frank'll take ages to get to it," he said with a laugh, brushing his hands on his jeans. "Let me climb up and clear it. 2 minutes, tops." I wavered. Frank wasn't keen on others tackling his to-do list, but it was only a gutter, right? Hank seemed well-intentioned. I fetched a glass of lemonade and left the screen door ajar as he ascended the ladder. The sounds of snapping twigs and splashing water drifted down. From the garden I watched him work, steady, skilled, not youthful but still agile. It brought back memories of Frank, who used to scale that ladder with ease. He finished fast, descended, and I handed him the drink. He asked to clean up and rest briefly, mentioning his knees weren't as strong as before. I agreed, pointing to the sink, and that's when I felt it, the stillness of the house, without Frank. Normally he'd have the radio playing or the TV murmuring. The quiet was strange. Every floorboard creak seemed amplified. I stood by the kitchen counter, suddenly noticing how sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust particles dancing over the fruit bowl. Hank leaned against the counter, sipping his lemonade. "Ever think about getting away yourself? Just taking off for a week?" I gave a polite smile. "I'm more of a stay-at-home type." "Sure, but still," he said. "It must feel lonely sometimes. Frank's always off fishing or hunting, leaving you here by yourself." His words, though spoken casually, made me tense. I grabbed a dish towel and kept my hands busy. "I've got my garden, my puzzles, classic films," I replied. "I enjoy the peace." He nodded, his gaze lingering too long. "You've got a serene way about you. Frank's fortunate. Not everyone's built for this lifestyle." I wasn't sure what he meant by this lifestyle, but I didn't press. I offered to pack him some leftover peach cobbler, and he smiled, stepping back as I reached for the fridge. "You're good to everyone, but don't you ever wish someone truly saw you? Really paid attention?" My heart skipped a beat. I froze, holding the cobbler container. Hank had always been respectable. Frank trusted him. So did I. But the softness in his tone, the way his eyes held mine, created an unexpected tension. I cleared my throat. "I should probably check in with Frank, see how his trip's going." He raised his hands as if retreating. "Didn't mean anything, just chatting." He took the cobbler, thanked me, his smile fading as he reached the door. I watched him walk away, vanishing behind the large maple near the mailbox. The moment the door closed, I locked it. That night, I sat on the sofa with a book open, but I didn't read. My mind kept circling back to our exchange, how something so routine could veer so strangely. Had I misread it? Was I overthinking a few words? Deep down, I knew I wasn't. Something had shifted, subtle but real. Frank called later from the cabin, his voice bright with fishing stories. I didn't mention Hank. I didn't want to alarm him or have him cut his trip short over something I couldn't fully articulate. But I felt altered, as if something had been knocked off balance. For days afterward, I kept the doors locked, even in daylight. I told myself it was just caution, nothing more. But truthfully, I couldn't shake the sense that a boundary had been crossed, however faintly. It wasn't really about Hank. It was about my space, how alone I'd felt without realizing it, how accustomed I'd grown to being unseen. His words had stirred something, not because they were kind, but because they made me wonder if I'd quietly stopped wanting more from life. Sleep eluded me that week. Every squeak of the floor, every branch swaying in the wind, made me sit up, not in fear but in heightened awareness. I began noticing small things, the flickering kitchen light, the chipped paint on the front door, details that had faded into the background over years. It was like rediscovering my own existence. And it all began with a glass of lemonade and a man who shouldn't have crossed my threshold. But this was far from over. Something else was brewing, like a shift in the air before a storm. I didn't yet know if it would shatter me or push me to finally take a stand. 3 days after Hank's visit, I found a folded note under the welcome mat. I thought it was a flyer or a delivery slip, but when I opened it, I saw a brief message in neat, blocky handwriting. Didn't mean to bother you, just wanted to lend a hand. H. Dot. My heart pounded too loudly in the quiet morning. The note was dry, as if freshly placed. I scanned the street instinctively. The neighborhood looked ordinary, houses silent, blinds shut, flags waving gently. No trace of Hank, no unfamiliar cars, nothing out of place. I crumpled the note and tucked it into my pocket. What unnerved me more? That he'd left it, or that I wasn't entirely shocked? Hank had always been considerate, helpful in his way, but this felt different, deliberate, almost secretive. Frank returned 2 days later, tanned and reeking of fish bait. He dropped his gear by the back door and kissed my cheek, as if nothing had changed. I cooked him a pot roast and nodded along to his tale of the fish that got away. I laughed at the right moments, but my thoughts were elsewhere. I wanted to tell him about Hank, but the timing never felt right. How do you describe something that seems so minor yet sits so heavily on your chest? So I stayed silent. I folded Hank's note again and slipped it into the drawer where we keep spare batteries and forgotten keys. Weeks passed. Spring gave way to early summer, and the garden flourished. I threw myself into weeding, pruning and repainting the bird feeder. Frank spent more time in his shed, tinkering with wood projects or his old radio. We weren't drifting apart exactly, but we were circling each other, comfortable, familiar, predictable. Then one day I found Frank on the back porch, his expression odd. He held a thick manila envelope. "Hank dropped this off while you were at the store," he said. Said it's something I should see. I wiped my hands on my apron and sat beside him. Frank carefully pulled out the contents. A proposal for a veterans community centre, an idea Hank had floated years ago, but never pursued. There were drawings, budget estimates, a donor list, and a few pages explaining its importance to him. Frank gave a low whistle. "He's put real effort into this." I nodded, keeping my face neutral. "You considering helping him?" "Maybe," he said. "I'm not big on meetings, but it's a solid cause. He thinks we'd make a good team pitching it to the mayor." My stomach tightened. The thought of Hank and Frank growing closer didn't sit right, though I couldn't explain why without unravelling everything. "Sounds worth looking into," I said softly. Frank smiled and squeezed my hand. "You're always so supportive." I nodded, but a quiet unease settled inside me. The next week, Hank's calls increased, first to Frank, then a couple of times to the house when Frank wasn't home. The first call, I let ring. The second, I answered. "Hey," he said. "Didn't expect to catch you. Just had a question about those fig trees you planted." I told myself it was innocent. Neighbours often asked about gardening, but his tone felt less like curiosity and more like probing. "They're doing well," I said curtly. "Bet they are. You've got a knack for that stuff." A pause. I heard birds chirping, maybe outside his window, maybe mine. It sent a chill through me. "I should get going," I said quickly. "Sure thing. Just thought I'd check in. Take care." That night, I lay awake, replaying his words, the pauses, how they made me feel small and uncertain. I didn't like it. I didn't like how it was changing how I saw my own porch, the phone on the wall, even Frank. I started spending more time at the library, A public space filled with soft voices and people who didn't ask questions that felt loaded. I picked up journaling again, a habit I'd dropped in my 50s. I needed a place to sort my thoughts without judgment. One afternoon, I sat in the library's reading nook, journal open. A woman nearby started chatting. Her name was Mara, about my age, with soft grey curls and a laugh like tinkling bells. We talked about books, grandkids, and local history. It felt ordinary. Then she said something that lingered. Ever feel like your life looks perfect on the outside, but something inside says, "This isn't quite enough"? I stared, unsure how she'd tapped into my thoughts. Lately, all the time, I admitted. Mara nodded. That's when I changed things. Not drastically, but enough to feel I wasn't just waiting for life to happen. That night, I wrote in my journal about Hank, the note, the phone call, how my hands trembled afterward. Then I wrote something I hadn't voiced. I miss being seen, but not like that. Not in a way that traps me. I miss being noticed with care, not expectation. I set the pen down and let that sink in. It wasn't about Hank anymore. It was about what I'd let myself accept. Quiet, polite, invisibility. The next morning, I told Frank I wanted to take a short trip. Maybe to visit my sister in Vermont, or stay by the lake where we camped when our boys were young. He looked surprised. "You've never wanted to travel alone before?" I smiled softly. "Maybe it's time I did, just for a little while." Frank nodded. "All right, I'll help you pack." And just like that, something shifted again. This time, because I chose it. I wasn't going to let someone else's presence, someone else's blurred boundaries, define how I felt in my own life. I chose a cozy inn in New Hampshire near the lake Frank and I visited when the kids were small. It had creaky floors, mismatched quilts, and the smell of fresh muffins each morning. I hadn't been there in over 20 years, but its familiarity was soothing. I didn't call it a getaway. It was a pause, a moment to untangle my thoughts without anyone else's expectations. Frank offered to drive, but I insisted on going alone. I needed to reconnect with myself. The first day, I strolled the shoreline trail, the sound of waves against rocks drawing me inward. I passed the bench where Frank and I once watched ducks with our youngest. The carvings, hearts, initials, a quirky fish with legs, were still there. I smiled. The second day, I wandered into town, browsing antique shops. I bought an old 1950s postcard of the lake on impulse. On my way back, I passed the chapel where Frank and I renewed our vows for our 25th anniversary. The sign was worn, but the bell still chimed hourly. That night, I sat by the inn's fireplace with tea, writing in my journal. A woman, June, a retired teacher from Maine, sat nearby, knitting. We chatted quietly. "My husband passed last year," she said softly. "I kept busy, but one day I realized I'd forgotten how to just be with my own thoughts. So, here I am." We spoke about gardening, the odd ache of being less needed, and how silence isn't always peace. June's eyes, like mine, were curious yet weathered, still open to something undefined. Later, as I brushed my hair in my room, I caught my reflection. Not sad, not lost, just calm. For the first time in a while, that felt like enough. On the third morning, I sat on the porch with my tea and the postcard. I wrote on the back, "You're allowed to want more than just comfort." I mailed it to myself, wanting to reread it at home to see if it still held true. That afternoon, Frank called. I expected casual chat, but his tone was cautious. "Did you know Hank stopped by again?" My heart quickened. "When?" "Yesterday. Said he was dropping off more papers for the Veterans Project, but he lingered. Asked if I'd heard from you. Said you seemed off, maybe overwhelmed." My mouth went dry. "What did you say?" "That you were fine, just needed space." I exhaled. I don't like that he showed up unannounced again. "Me neither," Frank said. "I didn't think much of it until I saw him hang around the porch, like he was waiting for something." I gripped the chair. "Frank, I should have told you sooner." I shared just enough. Hank's first visit, the note under the mat, the odd phone call. I kept my voice steady, avoiding drama, but Frank heard the weight behind my words. He was silent for a moment. Why didn't you say anything? I wasn't sure if it was real, if I was blowing it out of proportion. It's real, he said. You should never feel uneasy in your own home. That night, I barely slept, thinking how small moments can pile up when we dismiss them as insignificant, how I'd ignored too many before they pushed me to leave. I stayed one more day at the inn, needing the time. In my final journal entry, I wrote about myself, not Hank or Frank. I don't want to vanish into roles, wife, mother, neighbour. I want to know who I am now. The next morning, I packed slowly, stood on the porch watching the lake glisten. I wasn't fixed, but I felt grounded, not in a place, but in a choice. At the front desk, the innkeeper smiled. Back next season? Maybe, I said. But even if I don't return, I'll keep coming back to this version of me. I didn't know how Frank and I would start our next conversation, or what would happen with Hank, or how to redraw lines that had blurred. But I knew silence and politeness shouldn't cost my peace. Something had opened, and I wasn't going to seal it shut for anyone's comfort. In that choice, I found something new: resolve. I started the car, glanced at the lake, and drove home into the morning light. Frank was on the porch when I arrived, coffee mug in hand, as if keeping time. The garden had grown wild, lilies blooming, ivy climbing too high, but the house looked unchanged. Yet it felt different. He stood as I got out of the car. We didn't speak immediately. He carried my bag inside, and a new quiet settled between us, not tense, but thoughtful, like we were seeing something new. The house smelled of lemon cleaner and fresh grass. Frank had mowed, washed dishes, folded blankets just how I like them. I stood in the entryway, taking it in. "You okay?" he asked, setting my bag by the hall table. I nodded. "Yeah, I think so." He looked relieved but didn't push. He poured me water, handing it over like a small gesture of peace. Later, we sat in the backyard, the sun dipping behind the trees. Frank set Hank's envelope on the patio table. "I haven't called him back," he said. "Not since you told me." "I've been thinking." I waited. "We've been coasting, you and me. Comfortable, like worn-in shoes. Nothing wrong with that, but when Hank pushed in like he did, I realized I haven't been noticing you the way I should." I shook my head. "It's not about blame, Frank. Not even about him. It's about me. I let things slide, thought the quiet was enough. Then someone broke it. Wrongly, yes, but it woke me up." Frank rubbed his hands together. "I hate that he made you feel watched, that you had to leave to find peace. That's not right." "No, it's not," I said quietly. "And I don't want him here anymore." Frank nodded. "I'll handle it." We sat longer watching a robin pull a worm from the soil. It felt odd talking like this after years of routine, but it was necessary. The next morning, Frank called Hank from the porch, door closed. I couldn't hear, but when he returned, his expression was calm. "It's done," he said. "We're out of the community centre and we need space." My shoulders eased. That afternoon, the postcard I'd sent arrived. Frank handed it over, curious but respectful. I read it twice. "You're allowed to want more than comfort." I tucked it into my journal. It wasn't about rejecting my life, but questioning if I'd shrunk too much within it. Weeks later, June visited, passing through for a quilting event. We sat on the porch while Frank grilled, the air rich with charcoal and rosemary. I introduced them, and Frank was polite, but I noticed his quiet respect for June's presence. After she left, he said, "She's good for you." "You laugh differently with her." I smiled. "She reminds me I'm still growing. We both should be." Later that week, I asked Frank to walk the lake trail we hadn't visited in years. He agreed eagerly. We strolled slowly, the air cool, the light golden, the silence between us easy now, not heavy with unspoken words. At the old bench by the water, we sat. Boys nearby skipped stones, their laughter echoing. "I've been thinking," Frank said. "Maybe I need to shake up my routines too." We both needed a push to see what we'd missed. I breathed deeply. It's not about wanting more, but wanting different, space to feel alive again. He nodded. "I want that for you, and I want to be part of it if you'll let me." No grand gestures, just two people in their later years, rediscovering that love means letting each other grow. In the months that followed, we made small changes. Frank volunteered at the library, I joined a watercolour group, and we hosted Sunday dinners, talking about dreams, regrets, hopes, not just chores. Hank stayed away. The community centre plan fizzled and he moved on. I never saw him again, and I was fine with that. The house felt new, not from big changes, but from how we chose to see it. The same walls, but brighter light through the windows. One day, I opened my journal and wrote beneath the postcard, "You don't need to leave to start again. Sometimes, you just need to be seen." This time, I believed it without needing to mail it to myself.